From our apartment on Central Park West, the city lights below glittered like a fallen constellation, a cold, distant beauty that did nothing to warm the silence inside. The only noise was the whisper, quiet hum of the climate control, a sterile pulse in the vast living room. I rested a hand on my taut belly, the flutter of our daughter, a secret conversation between us, and stared out at the dark silhouette of the park, a void in the heart of the city's brilliance. At 38 weeks pregnant, my feet had become a distant memory, swollen into unrecognizable shapes. Tonight was Julian's coronation. He was unveiling the Apex, a skyscraper that pierced the Manhattan skyline. "This building isn't just steel and glass, it's a statement," he'd said that morning, adjusting the knot of his silk tie, his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, looking less like my husband and more like the king of a concrete empire. Julian's assistant had emailed hours ago. "The digital pre-release of Archdigest will be in your inbox shortly." I'd sent back a thumbs-up emoji, but the hours since had been a vacuum. He's in back-to-back interviews, I reasoned. With reporters, with investors, with the city's power brokers. The scent of the white lilies he'd sent, cloyingly sweet, filled our home with a funeral-like solemnity. The magazine feature was his victory lap, a high-gloss testament to the world he now commanded without me. I finally opened the link on my tablet, the act feeling less like a celebration and more like an obligation. The article began with fawning praise for Julian. "A visionary reshaping the city's very soul," the text gushed. There he was, in a full-page photo, standing in the lobby of the Apex. He projected an aura of unshakable control, the cool confidence of a man who bends steel and capital to his will. A surge of pride warmed my chest, but it turned to ice as I swiped to the next page. Maybe it was just the pregnancy hormones. Maybe the long weeks he claimed were spent on site visits were exactly that. Maybe my anxiety was just a side effect of being confined to this opulent prison. Then my gaze fixed on the behind-the-scenes photo, a candid moment, and I saw her. She wasn't just an employee in the picture. She was his counterpart, a silent co-regent. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted in a way that spoke of shared jokes and easy intimacy. In the photo, he was looking down at her, not at the camera, with a soft, unguarded expression I hadn't received in years. A sharp pain lanced through me, as if the air itself had solidified in my lungs. Around them, the rest of the design team was a blur of professional smiles, completely unaware that my world had just been fractured by a single, perfectly composed photograph. The baby kicked, a sharp protest under my ribs. "Easy, little one," I whispered, my voice trembling. That must be the lead architect he mentioned. For a moment, I clung to the thought. I sat frozen, one hand pressed to my belly, my mind racing to build a story. Any story that could protect me from the truth staring back from the screen. Julian was a king in his new castle. He wasn't just standing near her. For one wild, foolish second, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe it was an innocent moment, captured out of context. Perhaps in the main interview he would mention his loving wife, Amelia, waiting at home, making me a part of his triumph from afar. I clung to that fragile idea, knowing it was about to break. Then I read the caption beneath the photo. It wasn't a question, but a quote from Julian himself. "A building this ambitious needs more than a blueprint. It needs a soul," he'd said, his words printed in elegant serif font. Chloe Vance was that soul, the quote concluded. The camera had caught the look that passed between them, a silent, powerful current of shared history that had nothing to do with blueprints or zoning laws. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a developer praising his architect. This was a man presenting his true partner. The baby rolled, a slow, heavy pressure. "Oh," I breathed into the silent apartment. "Why is he looking at her like that?" I tried to swallow, but my throat was closed. My mouth went dry, and I was suddenly afraid to breathe, certain my lungs would shatter. I zoomed in on the photo, my fingers trembling on the screen. Her hand rested on his arm, and on her wrist was a delicate gold bracelet with a single, unique charm, a tiny, antique compass. And then the realization hit me, not as a fear, but as a cold, hard fact. That bracelet was Julian's grandmother's. He'd told me it was being held in a bank vault for our future daughter. He hadn't wanted me at the unveiling to keep me off my feet. He hadn't wanted me there because my role had already been filled. The spectacular apartment felt like a cage, its skyline view a mocking panorama. Every congratulatory text that buzzed on my phone was another twist of the knife. Every glowing sentence in the article was an insult. I should have closed the tablet. I should have protected myself from what else I might find. But my hand was paralyzed, driven by a morbid need to see the full extent of Julian's betrayal. And then I swiped to the final page. Julian's eyes met the camera in the main portrait, and for a terrifying second, it felt like he was staring right at me. There was no remorse, no guilt, only the gloss of absolute success. The woman, Chloe, stood near his shoulder, her face glowing with their shared victory. Her gaze was aimed directly at the lens, absorbing the moment, laying claim to it. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke shirt, the perfect image of a man who had conquered Manhattan and knew there would be no consequences. I only truly saw her, with awful clarity, after I saw that look between them. Before that candid shot, she was just an accomplished architect in a power suit, a danger my gut had refused to acknowledge. But once his private smile met hers, my attention zeroed in on her with a cold, terrifying precision. She was younger, not by much, but by enough to make a difference under the harsh glare of a photographer's lights. She carried herself with a sharp, polished ambition, the kind of unwavering confidence that comes from a lifetime of getting precisely what she desires. Her dress was minimalist and brutally expensive, her makeup an impeccable mask, her hair pulled back with surgical precision. She stood near him for the formal portrait, accepting his hand as it rested briefly on the small of her back. Her eyes challenged the camera as if she could see straight through it to me. There was no deference in her posture, no hint that she was a subordinate. There was just a brief, brilliant smile, that flicker of mutual understanding, and something more. A quiet claim to her position, not just as part of his team, but at the very heart of his success. She didn't fade into the background. She didn't look like an employee. Instead, she angled her body toward his, her shoulder almost brushing his arm. It was nearly imperceptible, but it was a clear signal, a silent declaration. In the article, Julian spoke again, lauding her indispensable vision. She listened in the candid shot, with her head tilted, her focus entirely on him, her lips curved into a flawless portrait of admiration. It was a masterful deception of partnership. A powerful kick from our daughter finally broke my trance. "Oh, my sweet girl," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Who is that woman?" The question echoed in the cavernous, silent apartment. I bent forward, clutching my belly, as if to shield her from the truth. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to find words that wouldn't poison the child inside me, a lie that burned less than the truth. "She's just someone who works with your daddy," I murmured. Chloe, in the photo, looked at Julian with unwavering devotion. She was basking in his glory, gauging their chemistry as a couple, and deciding, I was sure, if she was dealing with a wife who would make a scene or one who would simply fade away. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I pushed myself up, forcing my spine to straighten, forcing my lungs to draw a steady breath. I met her gaze on the screen, a complete stranger who had just leveled my life. I understood it then. She thought she had earned it all, not just the man, but his entire world, the prestige, the power, the role of his most essential partner. She had no clue she was just another line item in a ledger that would someday collect a debt she could never imagine paying. And neither of us knew that this polished public erasure was only the beginning. Julian came through the door 3 hours later, smelling of victory and expensive scotch. He didn't look for me. He didn't call out my name. He seemed completely unaware of my presence. He tossed his keys into a crystal bowl by the door, his triumphant air faltering only when he finally noticed me sitting there in the dark. Model. His features settled into the smooth, patient mask he wore for difficult zoning boards, the one designed to charm any opposition into submission. "Clara," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I was wondering where you went. They just announced it. We won the Sterling Prize. Not, 'I'm so sorry you had to see that.' Not, 'We have to talk.' Just a career update." In that single moment, everything became sharp and clear. His frustration wasn't for my broken heart. It was irritation at a complication on his big night. For the past 10 minutes, my phone had been lighting up with texts from friends, their congratulations on the award, feeling brittle and laced with an unspoken question. The confident way he walked toward me felt like a violation. Julian followed my gaze to the large screen displaying candid event photos and the distinctive silver bracelet on his protege's wrist, his jaw tightening as he realized what I now knew. "I'm on top of the world, Clara," he said, his voice clipped. "Can we please not ruin this right now?" Ruin this, as if the collapse of our marriage was just an inconvenient distraction. The baby gave a soft flutter, a tiny, insistent pulse against my ribs. I placed a hand on my belly, the life inside me a silent witness to his betrayal. "You forgot to mention your star partner was wearing my anniversary gift," I said, my own voice unnervingly calm. The steadiness in my tone was a surprise even to me. Julian flinched, a flash of pure annoyance in his eyes before he concealed it. "It's a prototype, Clara, a gesture of team appreciation." That was his critical mistake. Team appreciation was the kind of corporate doublespeak men like him used when the truth was simple and ugly. He glanced toward the bar. Sasha, as I was now certain she was called, had vanished, but her absence was a tangible cold front between us. "We can discuss it when we get back to the penthouse. I don't want you getting worked up in your condition." A profound chill settled deep in my bones. He was already using our unborn child as a weapon, trying to reframe my legitimate fury as some delicate, hormonal episode he needed to manage. "I think I'm strong enough for the truth," I countered. For the first time all night, Julian's gaze fell to the curve of my stomach. "Clara," he began, his attempt at a gentle tone sounding hollow and prefabricated. "Let's not be dramatic." I didn't respond. I just held his gaze with a look I hardly recognized as my own. It was terrifyingly still, sharp, and completely shattered. In the architectural journals, Sasha was lauded for her bold aesthetic. That bracelet wasn't a gesture, it was a statement. Julian squared his shoulders, his voice hardening. "We'll talk about this when you're being reasonable. We will handle this at home," he dictated. The words a final blueprint from a man who believed every problem could be designed away. And in that moment, I saw who Julian truly was when his curated world was threatened. A man who used logic as a bludgeon. A man who mistook quiet pain for consent. A man utterly oblivious to the demolition he was about to bring down on himself. Julian's award-winning smile remained fixed, as fragile as a scale model. He paused, studying Clara's expression, likely expecting tears or a quiet retreat, some kind of wifely deference that would confirm his control of the situation. Clara gave him nothing. She just looked at him with those clear, observant eyes that had learned to see the structural flaws beneath his polished facade. It was Sasha who reappeared, holding 2 flutes of champagne, her smile proprietary. "Julian," she began, her voice bright and celebratory. Julian's shoulders relaxed, a hint of relief on his face. "There you are." Sasha stopped, sensing the frozen tension between us, her smile faltering. I could almost feel the gears turning in her head as she assessed the scene. This wasn't a celebration. It was a confrontation. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her head tilting toward me. "Because you were discussing the prototype with her?" The question was a scalpel, sharpened by its feigned innocence. It carried no anger, only a partner's professional curiosity. The effect was devastating. Every bit of color drained from Julian's face. His mouth opened slightly before he snapped it shut. Whatever excuse he had prepared for me, whatever narrative he was about to construct, it crumbled under the simple weight of that question. Beside him, Sasha went completely still. For the first time, her flawless, ambitious poise cracked. Her eyes darted to Julian, waiting for him to take charge, to smooth it over, to protect the perfect, prize-winning image she had just become a part of. He said nothing. The ambient chatter of the awards ceremony seemed to fade. Industry rivals and critics nearby began examining their programs with a little too much intensity, their attention fixed on us. The entire ballroom seemed to be holding its breath. "That is not—" Julian started, but his voice failed him. He swallowed hard in the sudden quiet. "It's more complicated than that." Clara's brow furrowed. It didn't seem complicated on the screen. A knot of fear and pride twisted in my gut. I fought the urge to turn away, to shield myself from the suffocating silence and from the truth her husband was too much of a coward to admit. But a stronger instinct kept me planted there, letting his architecture of lies collapse on its own. Julian stepped closer, the movement stiff and awkward in his tuxedo. "Clara, these things can be very messy," he said, his voice strained. "Sometimes, professionals get their wires crossed." Clara tilted her head. "Then why do you look so guilty, Julian?" And that was it. Julian froze, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked exactly like what he was, a celebrated man, undone not by a screaming wife, but by the devastating precision of her quiet question. My eyes burned with tears I refused to let fall. This moment was no longer about my pain. This was the moment his colleagues and rivals finally saw the real man beneath the visionary genius. And Julian knew it. As his gaze met mine, the irritation in his eyes was finally replaced by a wave of raw, unadulterated panic. And for the first time all evening, he understood that a critical foundation had been broken beyond repair. No matter how he tried to redesign this later, the truth was out, and it had not come from me. Julian straightened up, his expression hardening as if bracing for a catastrophic budget overrun. The panic Clara had exposed vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, familiar determination. I knew that look. It was the one he got during tense client negotiations when a deal was about to collapse and he shifted from collaboration to brute force. "All right," he breathed, adjusting the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo. His voice dropped to the deep, resonant tone he used to intimidate junior architects. "This is finished." Finished. Not, "I am so sorry for the pain I caused." Not, "I can't believe I let this happen." Just finished. He did a quick, subtle scan of the room, acutely aware of the lingering stares of his competitors and patrons. He moved closer, his voice a poisonous whisper, meant only for me. "You will not make a scene, Clara. We will discuss this later, privately." My chest felt tight. I saw his strategy with perfect clarity. He wasn't speaking to his wife. He was assessing me as a structural risk, a volatile element that had to be contained before it brought down his public reputation. "No one is making a scene," I replied, my own voice just as quiet. "This is the scene, Julian." His jaw tightened. "You're being irrational," he hissed, his lips barely moving. "And the baby does not need this stress." The words were tactical, each one designed to undermine me. "You're irrational. You're unstable. You are the source of the problem." A hot tide of fury and disbelief washed over me. For years, I had scaled back my own ambitions so his could be monumental. I had deferred decisions, managed our private life so his public one could flourish, and convinced myself our silent partnership was a noble sacrifice. And now, at the ceremony meant to be his crowning achievement, with our child on the way, he was trying to paint me as the liability. Sasha shifted her weight, her designer heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet, her composure now visibly frayed. This was not the clean, strategic partnership she had planned. This was messy, personal, and brutally public. "Julian," I said, my eyes locked on his, "you do not get to design the ending to this." His expression turned to granite. "I am trying to protect this family." It was the most audacious blueprint he had ever drafted. He wasn't protecting our unborn child. He absolutely was not protecting me. He was protecting the brand of Julian Croft, the architectural prodigy who believed that if he spoke with enough quiet, unwavering certainty, reality itself would have no choice but to conform to his vision. I realized then that this was never just about another woman. It was about his profound, suffocating need for absolute control. And for the first time, a strange and powerful calm settled over me, and my hands stopped trembling. If I let him silence me here, he would use my silence to define me for the rest of our lives. Whatever happened next, I would not allow it. Not for myself, and certainly not for my child. It was Sasha who collected herself first. While Julian and I were waging our quiet war, she subtly recalibrated, as if reminding herself of her name on the firm's letterhead. Her posture corrected itself, her head tilted up, and she casually brushed a non-existent piece of lint from her tailored blazer. It was a subtle gesture, barely noticeable, but it conveyed an unmistakable and brutal message. She had no intention of going anywhere. Her gaze locked with mine again, but this time, the hint of apology was gone. There was no defiance, no shame, only the detached, calm evaluation of a chess master watching an opponent make a deeply emotional, predictable error. Then a faint smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was precise, controlled, an expression so carefully crafted it might have been mistaken for empathy. But beneath it lay a bedrock of absolute certainty. She was convinced this night, and this man, were already hers. "Julian," she said, her voice a soft murmur, as she finally placed a hand on his arm. "Darling, you're making the investors from Tokyo wait." Her hand on his suit was less a caress and more of a claim. The word darling, a declaration of ownership in our own home. She said it like an established fact, not a term of affection. Julian stiffened, a statue for one terrible second. His eyes darted from Isabella to my shocked expression, and then down to her perfectly manicured nails, pressing into the wool of his Brioni suit jacket. I could practically hear the calculations spinning in his mind, weighing the consequences of this very public scene against the simpler path of surrender. He didn't pull away. A nerve twitched in Julian's jaw as he gave a curt nod. "I'm on my way." With a small, self-satisfied smile, Isabella let go of him and turned, her entire bearing radiating victory. She was utterly certain he would follow her. It hit me then that she wasn't afraid in the slightest. Not of me, not of the bomb she had just detonated in our lives. In her version of the story, the final chapter was already written. She was sure Julian would manage me. He'd offer some soothing lie, promise to fix everything, and then he would go join her by the bar. I was just a messy detail to be handled, emotional, inconvenient, and already a relic of his past. She was the future, waiting for him at the other end of this disaster. A tiny foot nudged me from the inside, a private, frantic signal. She moves, like a queen who already has the crown, a voice in my head whispered. It felt hard to get enough air. That isn't confidence, a voice said, and I realized with a shock it was my own. That's a coronation. Julian, his hand already reaching for the handle of the glass door leading to the terrace, went still. He glanced back at me, a flicker of raw annoyance crossing his face before the well-worn mask of patient worry slid back into place. Amelia, honey, not here. We'll figure this out later. I have a board meeting webcast in 10 minutes that I absolutely have to prep for. Please. It wasn't a plea, it was a directive. My gaze drifted beyond him to a photograph on the wall. The two of us and Big Sur, smiling like people I no longer recognized. A cold, horrifying understanding washed over me. This was so much more than a sordid affair. Isabella was so confident because Julian hadn't even felt the need to be discreet. He took my acceptance for granted. He fully intended to walk out that door to his webcast, leaving me to fall apart, quietly, amidst the wreckage of our life together. What neither of them understood was that his astounding arrogance wasn't a sign of his power. It was his fatal flaw. It was a strategic blunder that was about to demolish the very future they were so smugly building. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a single accusation. My complete and utter stillness seemed to unnerve Julian far more than any outburst could have. He was prepared for the tears, for the accusations he could dismiss as hormonal overreactions. He had a strategy for my emotions. He had no contingency for my silence. I looked directly at him, not with fury, but with a chilling composure that felt like it belonged to someone else. Go, I said. The word was a stone dropped into a quiet pond, flat and carrying a weight of finality that was absolute. Julian seemed genuinely confused, as if I had suddenly switched to a language he had never heard. You're not going to make a scene? He sputtered. A tiny, fragile smile formed on my lips. Oh, I understand everything perfectly now. My whisper had more force than a scream. The silence in our Atherton mansion was thick and suffocating, filled with all the unspoken truths that were now exposed between us. My hand went to my belly in a protective, unconscious gesture. I felt a soft tumble from inside, a secret dialogue just between the two of us. The new life growing within me felt more real than the man standing by the door. I'm going to go stay at a hotel for the night, I announced, my voice steady. I need to think. I saw the relief wash over his face. His entire posture relaxed. The speed with which he agreed was a deeper wound than any harsh word. I turned and walked toward the master bedroom, my steps silent on the thick, cream-colored carpet. The weight of my own actions settled around me. From the back of the enormous walk-in closet, I pulled out a soft leather overnight bag. I packed my tablet, my wallet, and without a single backward glance at Julian, I walked out of the life we had so carefully constructed. The heavy, modern front door of the estate clicked shut, its soft sound a more definitive ending than any furious slam in the grand entryway. Julian. I forced myself not to look back. Each step down the long, landscaped driveway was a conscious break from our shared world, a life lived in one of Silicon Valley's most exclusive gated communities. The distant hum of the freeway was a sound from a reality I now had to navigate alone. I kept my gaze fixed on the sleek, black car I had summoned. A glance backward would have shown me the pair of ancient redwood trees we'd fought to preserve during construction, their massive trunks meant to symbolize our solid future. They were just trees now. The only thing that felt real was the insistent fluttering deep within my body. This small, defenseless life was now counting on me to build an entirely new world from the ruins of the old one. As the car pulled away from the gate, a notification lit up my phone's screen. I wouldn't allow myself to read his name. Not yet. Julian could wait. His carefully constructed web of excuses could wait. The apologies, the rationalizations for his betrayal. They were all left behind on the other side of that door. As the car sped through the manicured streets, a new thought began to take hold. I wasn't running away. This was the first strategic retreat I had made for myself in a 7-year marriage that had slowly become a beautiful cage. And while I had no idea what I would do in the next 5 minutes, much less the next 4 months of my pregnancy, I was certain of one thing. He was no longer in charge of my story. The hotel room was impersonal, modern, with a view of another high-rise and the windows of strangers. The exhaustion I had been suppressing finally overwhelmed me, a deep and profound weariness that settled into my bones. For a long while, I just lay on the starched, unfamiliar sheets, one hand resting on my stomach, as if I could absorb strength from the life inside. Only then did I reach for my phone, bracing myself for the digital barrage I knew was coming. 9 missed calls, 22 text messages, all from Julian. I dismissed them all without reading a single word. Instead, I opened the browser and navigated to the banking portal for my art gallery's business account, our joint investment. It was my baby, the company I had poured my heart into building. The page loaded, the loading icon spun, and then the figures resolved on the screen. A sick, icy wave of horror washed over me. The balance was 0. The entire account had been cleared out just this afternoon. The transaction history displayed a single massive wire transfer to a holding company I had never heard of. My inheritance, the initial capital from my family, the funds I had so carefully grown, it was all gone. For a full minute, the world became silent. I couldn't seem to draw a breath, as if a physical weight was crushing my chest. I kept hitting refresh, praying it was a technical glitch. It wasn't. This was deliberate. This was a scorched earth strategy. My hands were shaking as I tried to log into our personal brokerage portfolio. Access denied. A cold, automated prompt appeared. Your password has been reset by the primary user. Julian hadn't just been cheating on me. He had financially annihilated me. My phone buzzed again, an email from his attorney. The subject line stated, regarding asset division. Attached, please find the proposed terms for dissolution. Proposed. As if it were a negotiation. I stared at the dense, legal text until the words swam together. Dissolution. As if our marriage were a failed startup to be liquidated. As if he hadn't just waged financial war, leaving his pregnant wife completely destitute. I looked around the generic hotel room, at the abstract art on the walls, and my single small overnight bag. For the first time since Isabella had appeared in our home, a raw primal fear cut through my numbness. I had no access to funds, no relatives in this state, and the only person I would have turned to for help was the very man who had just declared all-out war. I sat on the edge of the bed, a cold shiver running through me, my brain replaying the moment the first seed of doubt was planted. His smart watch, left charging on the nightstand, a notification had lit up its screen from a high-end custom jeweler. Your bespoke piece for Isabella is ready for collection. The message had burned itself into my mind. He hadn't even tried to be careful. Now, his ruthless efficiency made terrifying sense. He never imagined I would see it before he left for his bored webcast. I curled into a tight ball, wrapping the thin comforter around my shoulders, and watched the distant, glittering lights of the city. And in the empty space where my shock had been, something new began to form. It was cold, it was sharp, and it was absolute resolve. It was pure fury. Because if Julian believed liquidating our portfolio would leave me powerless, he'd overlooked the one asset he could never touch. The woman I was forced to become now that I had nothing left to lose. Dawn crept over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in a cold, indifferent gray. It was too quiet, too normal for the wreckage my life had just become. The baby kicked, a soft flutter that reminded me I wasn't fighting this alone. I forced myself from bed, showered, and made tea, each movement stiff and robotic. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and saw the confirmed transaction from our wealth manager. The subject was clinical, devoid of any humanity. Asset realignment. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I clicked open the attached documents. He wrote about creating a frictionless financial environment for prenatal tranquility and the necessity of a stable home atmosphere for our child. He mentioned his punishing schedule as a hedge fund manager and my recent emotional unpredictability. Then I read the sentence that landed like a punch to the gut. To ensure all future discussions remain objective, it's best we communicate through our financial advisors. He was creating a paper trail of my supposed hysteria. He was already laying the groundwork for a custody battle. I scrolled further, my jaw aching from how tightly I clenched my teeth. He proposed a generous living stipend to cover all my needs through the pregnancy. He suggested I move to a more private residence he had already secured. Every calculated move was cloaked in the language of patronizing care. There was no mention of Sasha, no mention of the art gallery, built with my inheritance, that he was preparing to absorb. This wasn't a separation. It was a hostile takeover. I shut the laptop, my reflection staring back from the dark screen. My face was ashen, and my eyes were wide, but a new, cold fire was starting to burn in them. For years, I had mistaken Julian's cruelty for drive, his secrecy for genius. I had been an absolute fool. The sharp ring of the intercom made me jump. A quick look at the video feed showed a courier holding a legal envelope. I shook my head and pressed the ignore button. The silence of the sprawling penthouse suddenly feeling cavernous and suffocating. A wave of profound loneliness washed over me. I needed backup. My fingers trembled as I called my sister Maya in New York. "Clara? It's 1 a.m. here. What happened?" And then it all came out, the entire sordid story spilling from me in a desperate, choked confession. Maya let me talk until I ran out of words, the only sound being the faint static between Chicago and New York. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't soft. It was sharp and analytical. "This is a narrative war," she said. "Julian has always written the script. But Clara, be honest. When was the last time you acquired a piece of art for yourself without first considering how it would enhance the Croft Collection brand?" The question struck me with the force of a physical blow. Julian thought his fortune, his army of corporate lawyers, and this surprise attack gave him an insurmountable edge. He believed that bloodless memos and financial jargon could disguise his betrayal as a brilliant strategic move. What he failed to grasp was that by reducing our marriage to a transaction, he had stripped away all the emotion, leaving me with the ice-cold clarity I so desperately needed. I was finished trying to find a soul in a man who clearly didn't have one. If he intended to fight this battle with spreadsheets, then I would become an expert in opposition research. I would arm myself with invoices and artist contracts, and I would stop playing the role of the docile, supportive wife. My sister's lack of empty reassurances was far more powerful than any emotional outburst could have been. As an investigative journalist, she lived in a world of harsh truths. Her silence was the sound of 100 different angles of attack being considered and refined. I paced the marble floor of the penthouse, the phone pressed hard against my ear as I waited for her verdict on my ruined life. She was mapping his vulnerabilities, identifying pressure points, and planning the opening salvos of a counter-campaign. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and dangerous. "Clara, he isn't just shielding assets. He's manufacturing a case to portray you as an unfit mother." My own voice was a raw whisper. "Maya, what do I do?" Maya's tone turned clinical. "When you merged your gallery's holdings with his fund, did his legal team draft the agreement?" The question felt like a shock of ice water. "I did," I admitted. "They managed everything. It just seemed more efficient." A cold knot of dread formed in my gut. He had planned this from the very beginning, even before the wedding. My hand shook as I braced it against the cold glass of the window. "You did nothing wrong, Clara," Maya said, her voice resolute. "You trusted your husband. That isn't a flaw in your character." She paused, taking a breath. "But you're dodging the real question," she pushed. "He gave you a business model for your life. He set the terms. In all that time, did he ever once ask you what your vision was?" The long, echoing silence that followed was the only answer she needed. "No one ever asks for your vision, Clara," Maya said, her voice softening slightly. Her words broke a dam inside of me. I sagged against the cool window, horrified not by the truth of it, but by the fact I had never let myself acknowledge the massive, empty space at the center of my marriage. "I've watched him for years," Maya continued, her voice hardening again. "Julian launches, Julian acquires, and you just build the beautiful stage for it all to happen on. But nobody is protecting your interests." A single scalding tear slid down my cheek. I wrapped my free hand around my belly, a useless gesture to somehow hold the pieces of my life together. "I'm fine," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I have to be." "I know," she replied, "but I am so damn relieved. You finally see the monster behind the philanthropist facade." Her grip on the phone felt tangible, her resolve traveling across the country. "I'm booking you on the first flight to New York." In that instant, an idea that was both terrifying and liberating began to form. Julian hadn't just underestimated my own strength. He had completely forgotten about my sister, for the war that was coming, the injunctions, the depositions, the smear campaigns. He had absolutely no idea what kind of journalistic hurricane he had just unleashed. The most damaging witness to his true nature was already gathering my ammunition. I found Evelyn Reed through one of Maya's trusted sources. The text had been blunt. "You're meeting her in Chicago. The appointment is booked. She dismantles bullies like him for a living." Her office was on the top floor of a historic building on the Loop, the kind of place where corporate dynasties were quietly taken apart with surgical precision. I sat in the silent reception area, holding a cup of tea I couldn't stomach, feeling like an imposter in a world of high-stakes finance and power. "Clara?" a calm voice asked. I looked up. The woman was in her late 40s, projecting a quiet authority that needed no introduction. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking my measure not with sympathy, but with a focused, professional curiosity. "Please, come in," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. "Thank you." She gave a short, businesslike nod and sat, placing a single slim folder on the desk between us. We exchanged a few forgettable pleasantries about the Chicago wind and the city's architecture. The conversation was perfectly neutral until her eyes landed on my tablet screen, where I had been staring at the catalog for a new artist, and her polite facade instantly vanished. "Julian Croft," she said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. An icy shock shot through me. How could you possibly know his name? She met my gaze for a long moment before letting out a slow, weary breath. This is exactly what I was afraid of. A terrible sense of dread began to crawl up my spine. Afraid of what? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she offered her hand. I'm Evelyn Reed. I specialize in dissolving hostile financial partnerships. That explained the confidence. I had to understand. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. 15 years ago, I was the forensic accountant who represented his first partner during their buyout, she said, each word falling like a shard of glass in the quiet room. The world around me faded to a low hum. I know his playbook, she went on. The initial charm offensive to gain control of all assets, followed by the sudden, strategic restructuring, which is actually a trap. The condescending calm he adopts the second he has you cornered. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Are you telling me he has a history of doing this? She gave one slow, deliberate nod. The ventures are different, but the script is always the same. I recognized his methods the moment your sister described the situation. I braced myself for another wave of anger or grief, but what washed over me was something else entirely. Validation, not because the betrayal was any less painful, but because for the first time since that asset alert flashed on my screen, I knew I wasn't going insane. Evelyn slid her business card across the polished wood desk. I am not here to persuade you, she said plainly, but our meeting seems to be more than just a coincidence, and I know for a fact that you do not deserve what he has planned for you. My eyes moved from the simple, elegant card to her face. What do I do? Her expression was as solid as granite. I suggest you stop absorbing his version of the story and start building your own. As my cursor blinked on the screen, a chilling realization settled over me. Julian didn't have a plan for a divorce. He had a business plan for my obsolescence. He had a risk assessment model for my emotions. The one variable he hadn't accounted for was me, sitting in our Manhattan penthouse, having just stumbled upon his entire operational blueprint. I found it in a password-protected folder on our shared server, labeled simply contingency. The password? The project code for the first building we ever designed together. The woman whose name I found in those files, Evelyn Reed, didn't offer condolences. She offered clarity. In her sterile midtown office, she let my story unfold in the quiet, giving my shock room to breathe. She let me feel the weight of the betrayal before asking if I was looking for a shoulder to cry on or a sharpened tool. I'm not asking you to believe me, she said, her voice calm and measured. I'm asking you to believe his own documentation. She turned her monitor, displaying not a personal email, but a labyrinthine chart of LLCs and offshore holding companies. The strategy is always the same, she began, tracing a line of ownership on the screen. First comes the ambitious joint venture, a project that entwines your finances and your reputation. Then, the grand gestures, a penthouse in Miami, a majority stake in a gallery, assets that are really just golden handcuffs. After that, he begins the quiet erosion. My stomach clenched. He leverages shared capital, she continued, not in big, obvious chunks. It's a slow, steady reallocation into untraceable development funds until the empire you built together is nothing but a hollow legal shell. Then, his behavior shifts. He becomes hyper-focused, almost obsessively supportive. I thought of Julian's email from that morning. Let's align on a workflow for the next quarter. I dug my nails into my palm. And the baby? I asked, my voice a dry whisper. Evelyn's gaze became steel. The baby is his closing argument. He'll use your pregnancy, the emotional toll of your work, your nesting instincts, to paint you as distracted and unstable, unfit to manage your own architectural firm. He will present himself as the stable center of gravity in a chaotic time. It took all my strength to form the next words. Has this worked for him before? She paused, her expression unreadable for a second. With devastating short-term success, she confirmed, her tone devoid of emotion. My last client's separation was a siege. He used the legal system itself as a weapon, she stated. But I learned his methodology. I watched him systematically convince these brilliant, accomplished women that their own instincts were flawed, all while he projected an aura of unshakable reason. By the time they understood the game, they were already in checkmate, reacting to his moves instead of making their own. A cold, sharp focus cut through my rising panic. He's banking on me to break, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Evelyn gave a single, sharp nod. It is the foundational assumption of his entire strategy. I looked back at the screen, at the cold, corporate flowchart of my own destruction. The blueprint was a waking nightmare, but seeing the architecture of his deceit was also profoundly clarifying. Sophie, I said suddenly, the lawyer, is she part of the plan? A thin, mirthless smile touched Evelyn's lips. She knows the version he's told her, that you're creatively burnt out, that the marriage has become more of a professional partnership, that he's trying to engineer a clean, amicable exit. The feeling that rose in me wasn't jealousy. It was a sudden, sickening wave of pity. She thinks she's his next merger, I whispered. They always think they're the endgame, Evelyn said, her voice flat. I leaned back in the leather chair as the events of the past year snapped into a horrifyingly logical sequence. The sudden pressure to co-invest in the Hudson Yards project, his constant depositions that required trips to the Cayman Islands, the way he'd proudly put our Hamptons house solely in my name. Julian wasn't panicking because I'd discovered his affair. He was executing a hostile takeover of our life, a plan that had been in development for years. The most terrifying part wasn't that he thought he was smarter than me. It was that he was so certain I would never even understand the rules of the game until he had already declared himself the winner. I looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. So how do you counter an opponent who has already mapped out your every possible response? She slid a thick file across the polished mahogany desk toward me. You don't play his game. You redesign the entire building. For the first time since my world had cracked open, I felt the solid certainty of a foundation. It wasn't hope. It was a counter-strategy. I didn't call Julian when I left her building. That was the first move he could never have anticipated. Instead of confronting him with an emotional firestorm, I did something far more unnerving to a man obsessed with predicting outcomes. I became utterly predictable. I responded to his project emails promptly. My replies were concise, professional, and focused entirely on architectural specifications, a flawless impersonation of the overworked, distracted wife he needed me to be. While he assumed I was breaking down, I was drafting new blueprints. Evelyn connected me with a senior litigator. I began diverting all income from my independent consulting projects into a newly formed corporate entity under my sole control. We started the painstaking work of tracing every dollar Julian had funneled into his labyrinth of LLCs over the past 3 years, creating a precise financial schematic of his escape plan. I never mentioned a single word of it. I was simply collecting my data. At night, with the lights of Central Park twinkling below, I would sit with my laptop, drinking mint tea and studying New York corporate law, precedent-setting, intellectual property cases, and strategies for piercing the corporate veil. I was learning a new language, one where a collaborative email was an exhibit of manipulation and professional detachment was a position of power. Julian sent another email. Glad we're in lockstep on the zoning variances. Critical we project stability for the baby. I almost choked on my tea. He mistook my professionalism for submission. He saw my composure as a character flaw. He read my silence as acquiescence, because that was the only role he had written for me in his grand design. Evelyn had advised me to wait. Men like Julian become arrogant when they believe they're facing no opposition, she'd said. Let him build his case for you. And so I played my part. I attended project meetings via Zoom. I never asked about the Cayman Islands LLC. I never questioned the bizarrely structured financing he presented. I let him lecture me on debt-to-equity ratios and long-term capital gains, knowing that every patronizing word was another brick in the foundation of my case. In the background, my new lawyer filed the standard procedural requests for financial discovery, a quiet, bureaucratic step he was legally obligated to fulfill. When the documents arrived, his entire structure was exposed. Julian hadn't just hidden money. He had methodically laundered our shared success. There was a network of shell corporations and real estate trusts, all cross-collateralized against assets I had designed and built, all predicated on the assumption that I would be too emotionally distraught to look for them until it was over. Evelyn looked at me over the top of the paperwork. This is a meticulously constructed fortress, I nodded. I know. I helped design it. What Julian didn't grasp was that my goal was never to publicly demolish his real estate empire. I had no desire for a messy, tabloid-fueled war. I was assembling a legal case so structurally sound that he would have no leverage, no escape clause, and no room to maneuver. Every email he sent explaining basic zoning laws to me, a partner in one of the city's top architectural firms, became proof of his coercive control. Every attempt to frame me as the fragile pregnant artist only strengthened the documented pattern of his own calculated deceit. And document by document, without a single raised word, I was quietly architecting a new ending to the story he was so sure he controlled. By the time he understood, I was no longer playing a role in his strategy, but executing my own. The terms of our separation were already set in stone. This time, I wasn't just another asset on his balance sheet. I was the majority shareholder. Sophie called me 3 days later. Her name flashed on my phone, the call coming directly from her firm's main line. It was a move of supreme overconfidence, and I let it go to voicemail twice before finally picking up. Clara? She asked, her voice a practiced, cheerful alto. It's Sophie Dubois. I'm on the legal team for Julian's Hudson Yards project. The Hudson Yards project. I closed my eyes for a beat. I know who you are. A crisp, professional silence stretched between us. I just thought it was prudent to connect, she said, her confident tone beginning to fray at the edges. There seems to have been some kind of miscommunication. Julian is under an immense amount of pressure with the second-round financing. I said nothing, letting her voice echo in the void. The excuses tumbled out of her then. A rehearsed monologue about aggressive lenders and zoning board hearings, and how the last thing anyone needed right now was any public friction. It was the standard corporate playbook for de-escalating a situation, designed to manage the human fallout without admitting any corporate liability. But then, the carefully constructed legal facade began to crack. He's not responding to my emails, she said, her voice now tight with a note of rising panic. He said all future communication needs to go through his senior counsel, to avoid any conflict of interest. And there it was, the clause in the contract she had never seen. Julian hadn't chosen her over me. She was just another consultant, a temporary legal asset hired to facilitate a transaction, who was now being dismissed. With the new merger facing unexpected headwinds, he was clearly cutting his losses. "I understand," I said, my voice betraying no emotion. Sasha let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. "This makes no sense. He promised me a lead partnership on the new tower." I suppressed the urge to laugh bitterly. Instead, I asked, my tone almost a whisper, "Did he ever put that promise in a signed partnership agreement?" The dead silence that followed was all the confirmation I needed. She tried to recover. "He mentioned you were going through a difficult period, that this separation could get messy, and he had to protect the firm's reputation for the investors." My anger evaporated, replaced by an icy, clear resolve. "He says that to everyone," I said flatly. "It's his classic playbook, when he needs you to agree to his terms without putting up a fight." I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. What is that supposed to imply?" she stammered. I chose my next words like a surgeon selects a scalpel. "It implies that if he were truly planning to build a future with you, he would be merging your portfolios, not just showing you architectural blueprints for a future that will never be built." Another pause, this one heavier than the last. "And he's not," she whispered, the cold reality finally hitting her. "No," I confirmed softly, "he's not." The call ended moments later. There were no insults, no final accusations, just the quiet hum of a woman realizing she was nothing more than a liability he had to write off. That night, my lawyer, Miss Davies, forwarded me an email. Arthur's legal team had filed for a continuance, citing unprecedented instability in the commercial real estate market that was impacting his personal cash flow. He was stalling. Sasha had truly believed she was the crown jewel of his portfolio, the next skyline-defining tower. She never understood that for men like Arthur, partners aren't upgraded for better models. They are liquidated and replaced with safer properties. When the facts became inconvenient, he did what he always did. He buried the liability. Arthur's world didn't implode all at once. It started to decay, the way his developments always did, in hidden architectural plans and offshore accounts. He was certain no one would ever have the authority to audit. But this time, the elaborate corporate firewall he'd constructed didn't shield him. It ensnared him. Ms. Davies called me on a Tuesday. "The forensic accounting team cracked the server for his shell corporation," she said, her voice crisp and decisive. "And they've traced the account funding the Serafina project directly to Sasha." I stood in my new, much cozier apartment, watching the sailboats on Lake Michigan, in a city that had already forgotten the real estate mogul who once promised to reshape its skyline. "So what's next?" I asked. "It means he committed wire fraud and embezzled from the partnership," she explained. "As soon as that's filed with the court, his credibility with the entire Chicago real estate community is finished." Arthur missed a crucial meeting with his lenders, and then the follow-up. His primary investors put his next funding round on indefinite hold, then rescinded their offer completely. Every broken promise activated a new penalty clause in his loan agreements. Every fee dragged another one of his secrets into the light. During his deposition, he was dismissive and arrogant, his famously calm, strategic demeanor crumbling under a rage he couldn't conceal. The man who gave keynote speeches on financial transparency couldn't explain the gaping holes in his own project's budget overruns. His responses grew vague, his logic full of inconsistencies. That's when Ms. Davies stepped in. "Mr. Sterling," she stated evenly, "this whole exercise is about establishing a clear paper trail." "Paper trail?" The phrase hung in the air of the sterile conference room, a warning he couldn't ignore. Weeks later, the judge's decision was delivered. A court-appointed receiver would take full control of all his business and personal assets. Immediate repayment of all capital diverted to his fraudulent side projects. I was awarded sole custody of our infant son, Leo, with Arthur's visitation rights revoked until he underwent a court-mandated psychological evaluation. It wasn't the revenge I once craved, but the security the evidence had guaranteed. Arthur attempted to do damage control, issuing carefully crafted press releases to business columnists, but the story was far too juicy. The professional consequences were swift and total. The Chicago Architectural Biennial announced his keynote had been canceled due to unforeseen scheduling conflicts. His name was quietly removed from the board of a prestigious Civic Development Award. The young associates he had mentored were suddenly unavailable to take his calls. I took no pleasure in witnessing his empire crumble. From my quiet corner of the city, I observed the dynasty he'd constructed on leveraged debt and aggressive marketing begin to buckle under the weight of his own fraudulent accounting. Arthur had always navigated the world as if rules were for ordinary people who lacked the creativity to find loopholes. He never conceived that the rot would start in his own foundation. The final text he ever sent me appeared on my phone screen late one evening. This wasn't in any of my projections. I looked at the message, then set my phone face down on the table. This was the only way this could have concluded. He was just too surrounded by his sycophantic inner circle to realize it because, up until now, someone had always been there to clean up his messes. As I settled Leo into his crib that evening, he shifted and gazed up at me. "Are we okay now, Mama?" "Yes, my love," I whispered, my voice firm. "We are." And for the first time since I'd discovered that hidden folder of blueprints, I knew it was the absolute truth. Arthur had lost the one asset he prized above any skyscraper, his impeccable public image. And for that kind of reputational damage, there was no insurance policy. Our new brownstone was a tiny fraction of the size of the glass and steel penthouse we had escaped. The windows overlooked a tree-lined street instead of the sweeping Chicago skyline, and the antique radiator hissed and popped. But it was our sanctuary. It was bathed in morning sun, and it was a 5-minute stroll from Leo's daycare. When we departed, we brought only what could fit in my car, along with a profound quietness I hadn't felt in years. It seemed that serenity didn't require a concierge and a full-time staff. Our lives settled into a new, softer cadence. Mornings were no longer a mad dash dictated by a shared digital calendar. I would drink my tea while Leo, strapped into his high chair, would happily chatter at the squirrels on the windowsill and decorate his hair with oatmeal. I created a small drafting table in the corner of our living room, the scratch of my pencil a gentle rhythm against the city's distant murmur. No one was there to question my designs. No one was there to dissect my word choices. No one was there to gently hint that my recollection of a conversation was flawed. In the evenings, with Leo fast asleep, I would curl up with a book. The low hum of the refrigerator, a comforting sound, never once flinching at the whisper of the private elevator arriving at our floor. I didn't miss the cold, cavernous silence of that glass house in Lincoln Park. I didn't miss that relentless, grinding ambition that we had told ourselves was simply the price of success. I didn't miss the way I had trained myself to rehearse every thought before I dared to speak it aloud. This newfound autonomy was quieter and more meaningful than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. My lawyer, Ms. Davies, would call me occasionally, not about the case, but just to check in. "You sound so grounded, Genevieve," she remarked during one of our chats. I hadn't known how much I needed someone else to notice. Arthur became a string of scheduled, detached obligations. His presence diminished to formal emails and motions filtered through our respective legal teams. He no longer issued commands disguised as casual suggestions. He no longer spun intricate webs of justification. His power over my world had utterly dissolved, and with it, the unshakable confidence he once wore like bespoke armor. It was my friend Chloe who first gave words to the change in me. "You're laughing from your gut again," she said, one afternoon, as we sat on a park bench watching the toddlers play. "Am I?" I replied, genuinely taken aback. She nodded with the kind of certainty only a lifelong friend possesses. "Absolutely. It's all the way back." A true, deep laugh escaped me, and I was stunned by how completely right she was. I wasn't wealthier. I hadn't been saved by a white knight. I wasn't miraculously without worry. But I was independent. I set up my own internet. I made my own choices. I trusted my own gut without needing a second opinion. The life we were creating wasn't engineered for public approval. It was real, and it was entirely ours. There are some nights, in the stillness after 1 a.m, when my thoughts wander back to that woman staring at a monitor of incomprehensible spreadsheets, feeling her world fracture with every line item she unraveled. I wish I could reach back in time to speak to her, not to say it would be easy, but to promise her that the foundation she was laying for herself would one day feel truly solid again, and that would be everything. I found my new beginning on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was at a small cafe in my neighborhood, the air thick with the smell of old books and fresh espresso. Leo was with his grandmother for a few hours, and I had come alone to sketch. I was working on designs for a new community center, a building meant to bring people together, not tear them apart. And as I drew, I realized this was it. It was my name on the blueprints. It was my vision, my own foundation, built to last. He wasn't putting on a show for anyone. He was just completely absorbed, sharing his love for his craft with a quiet strength. His voice was steady and warm. He spoke about where he sourced his vegetables as if they were old acquaintances, the importance of supporting local farms, and the simple satisfaction of creating something nourishing with your own hands for others. I found myself drawn in, staying to listen far longer than I had intended. I was admiring a basket of heirloom tomatoes when he approached me. "Soaking up the Saturday market madness?" he asked, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "It's incredible," I answered. "It just feels real." A soft chuckle escaped him. Real usually tastes a lot better than mass-produced. We chatted for a bit about the city, the best places for brunch, and other simple, pleasant topics. He never questioned why a woman like me was navigating the bustling market by herself on a weekend. He didn't boast about the Michelin stars his restaurant had earned or push his brand on me. He just seemed to give me his undivided attention. When I mentioned Noah's name casually, his expression softened with understanding, not pity. "I have a son," he shared. "He's with his dad this weekend." The statement was a simple fact, delivered without any dramatic backstory. We exchanged numbers with an ease that felt like a fresh start. Over the following months, our connection grew in small, quiet moments. He would text me a picture of a funny-shaped potato. We would meet for hot chocolate at a little cafe on a snowy Chicago afternoon, or we would simply sit on a bench in Lincoln Park, watching the city lights come on without needing to fill the silence. He was never prying, never pushed for information about my past, and seemed to be completely fine with whatever I chose to share. Then one evening, as we watched the waves of Lake Michigan, he said something that resonated deep within me. "I have no desire to try and patch up whatever came before," he said, his eyes on the distant horizon. "I would just be honored to be a part of whatever future you decide to build." It was the polar opposite of everything I had known with Julian. Leo wasn't trying to renovate my personality. He wasn't intimidated by my history. He wasn't offering some perfectly curated, high-gloss existence. And for that reason, the emotional fortress I had so carefully constructed around myself began to feel heavy and unnecessary whenever I was near him. Leo wasn't a reward I'd earned for surviving my past. He was a new path that became visible only after I had learned to navigate the terrain of my own heart. And for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, that felt like solid ground. A place where I could imagine building a new life with someone. We were intentional. That was the silent understanding between us from the very beginning. Life had already shown us both how dangerous it is to mistake a bonfire of passion for the steady warmth of a genuine partnership. So we moved slowly, allowing trust to blossom in the quiet corners of our lives. My son Noah met Leo a few months later, not as a prospective stepfather, but simply as Mom's friend, Leo. He came by to help us plant a small herb garden on our balcony and got into a spirited discussion about whether a shark or a tiger would win in a fight. Leo never forced it. He wasn't trying to be the cool new guy or offer unsolicited parenting tips. He was just present, consistently kind, and let Noah set the pace for their relationship. One evening, as we were cleaning up after a simple meal, Noah looked over at Leo and said, "The apartment feels happier when you're here." A real smile spread across my face, because his words perfectly described the feeling. Leo just smiled back and continued drying a bowl. The proposal came on a completely normal Thursday. We were at the Garfield Park Conservatory, surrounded by the humid air and the scent of orchids and damp earth. Leo turned to me with a question that was as honest and grounded as he was. "Chloe, would you want to design a life with me?" he asked. "On our own timeline." There wasn't a diamond ring or a grand spectacle, just a profound sincerity in his gaze. My answer was immediate and unwavering. We were married in a small clearing at the Chicago Botanic Garden. We had a few rows of simple wooden chairs and bouquets of wildflowers, with nothing done for show. Noah walked me down the grassy aisle, carrying our rings in a small, smooth wooden box that Leo had made for him. As Noah gave us the rings, he whispered, "You seem happy, Mom. Like, really, really happy." It wasn't a loud, triumphant kind of happiness. It was the kind that settles deep into your soul and makes a permanent home. Julian wasn't even a fleeting thought. He didn't have to be. He was a character from a book I had finished reading years ago. As Leo and I said our vows, we didn't promise an existence without challenges. We promised to be patient, to be honest, and to be a team, especially when things got difficult. Later, as the evening air turned cool and the sound of our friends' laughter drifted through the trees, Noah came and hugged both of us. "This is nice," he said. That was the only approval that ever truly mattered. The life I had lost, the one defined by penthouse views and real estate galas, had once seemed like everything. But standing there, barefoot on the soft grass, surrounded by people who loved the woman I had become, I finally understood the truth. My old life wasn't shattered. It was just cleared out, creating space for something real to grow. And what grew there wasn't revenge or victory. It was peace. I found myself at O'Hare International Airport 2 years later. A different airline, a new trip, but the same hopeful woman reflected in the polished floors. The quiet whistle of the tea kettle boiling had become the familiar music of our evenings, a peaceful rhythm for our new life. This time Noah glanced up from his drawing, a smudge of crayon on his cheek, his bangs in his eyes. Leo was chopping carrots at the counter, and he caught my eye with a smile that was all comfort. It wasn't a question, just a silent, stable connection between us. I stopped, my hand on a cabinet door. The memory struck me like a jolt of static electricity. A similar chill ran down my spine, even in this warm, cluttered kitchen, a phantom memory of the moment my world fell apart. My old life, a masterpiece of minimalist design, was revealed to be an elaborate fake. The truth didn't come with a scream, but with the silent click of a mouse opening a hidden folder. I can still feel the cold shock that seized me, my hand frozen on the desk as I saw the proof of his deceit, not in secret emails, but in a set of architectural blueprints for a second life. Leo noticed my far-off look and touched my arm. "Clara, you with me?" he murmured. I managed a weak smile. "I am, just remembering a past life." He understood completely. He didn't have to say a word. My son Noah glanced around our little kitchen, full of charm and clutter. Julian's house had speakers inside the walls, he observed, with the pure curiosity of a child, not a hint of nostalgia. "That it did," I replied smoothly. He considered this, then pointed. "I think our little Bluetooth one on the bookshelf is better." I agreed. As we ate our meal, the apartment filled with laughter and the aroma of roasted chicken. Through the glass, the skyline of Chicago glittered against the night, a vast tapestry of a million different stories, some grand, some quiet. I knew then that the skyline views, the automated home, the effortless wealth, none of that had been the real prison. The prison was the performance, the constant pressure to maintain an image of flawlessness, the fear of that image cracking, and the deeper fear of admitting that the celebrated real estate mogul I had married was a man I didn't know at all. I had faced that fear, not by becoming tougher, but by allowing myself to fall apart, by choosing a wonderfully messy, authentic life over a sterile, calculated one, by escaping that glass tower when staying would have meant the complete erasure of my own identity. Julian Kane was now just a name I saw in the financial pages, tied to some new skyscraper development. He wasn't someone I hated or had forgiven. He was simply no longer the architect of my reality. That chapter was over. The only thing that mattered was what I had designed for myself since then. A home filled with laughter, not with smart home schedules. A partnership founded on trust, not on a public image. A son who was learning that love is about showing up for one another, not about playing a part for an audience. As we cleared the table, Leo wrapped his arms around my waist from behind. Noah started doing a goofy robot dance toward his room, a huge smile on his face. This was real. I glanced at the glowing numbers on the microwave's clock, then looked back at my family, and a deep sense of calm settled over me. Some endings destroy you, but others liberate you. That afternoon in the penthouse office did both, and standing here now, in my own kitchen, I finally understood the full circle of my story. I didn't lose my life in that developer's ivory tower. I broke out of it. As we conclude this narrative, let us pause for a moment, because if you have followed this story to its conclusion, it is probably because some part of this experience resonated with you on a deep, personal level. This was never just a tale of infidelity and money. It serves as a potent reminder that our most formative experiences are often the ones that break us, because they are what give us the opportunity to rebuild ourselves into something more genuine and resilient. A key piece of wisdom comes from the Stoic tradition. The philosopher Seneca once noted, "True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future." The pain Julian caused was a chasm, but Clara's path to healing didn't start with thoughts of vengeance. It began the moment she decided to build a new life, her own identity, on a foundation of truth instead of his carefully constructed lie. There's an old saying that the obstacle is the path. For her, the damning blueprints, the suffocating pressure of Chicago's high society, and the profound betrayal became the very framework she used to reconstruct her life, transforming her deepest wounds into her greatest strengths. This narrative illustrates that abandoning a picture-perfect existence isn't a sign of defeat, and embracing a more modest life isn't settling for less. More often than not, the most courageous act is trading a gilded cage for an imperfect but authentic freedom. If this story struck a chord with you or reflected a chapter from your own experience, know that you are not walking this path by yourself. We invite you to like this video, pass it along to anyone who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more content that explores the heart of the matter. Your journey and your time with us are deeply valued, and your personal narrative is always unfolding. The story you just experienced is a piece of fiction, crafted purely to explore human emotion and tell a compelling tale. Although it draws inspiration from common life struggles and universal themes such as complex relationships, domestic challenges, and the quest for self-discovery, all characters, events, and circumstances portrayed are products of imagination. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to actual events or places, is completely coincidental. This story is not presented as a factual report, should not be taken as legal advice, and makes no real-world allegations against any party. Its purpose is to delve into emotional truths and timeless lessons by way of a fictional account. We ask our audience to engage with this content as a dramatization meant to inspire reflection, empathy, and conversation, not as a factual representation of any person or incident. This fictional work is not intended to cause harm, spread misinformation, or engage in slander. It is presented solely for entertainment, to encourage meaningful dialogue, and to build an emotional connection with our community.